The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Very interesting news out of Luxembourg. Luxembourg is going to be the first country to make all of its public transportation free. Now, Luxembourg is a country that can afford to do this. There's no question about that. Very wealthy country. And now trains, trams, and buses will simply be free under the plans of the re-elected coalition government that's led by Xavier Bettel, who has just been sworn in for a second term as prime minister. This is a very interesting proposal. And I've been in cities in Europe, like, for example, I've been in Paris before on days when pollution is worse than normal, and Paris will make public transit free in order to encourage people to take the subway or the RER train into work as opposed to commuting in. They've also tried a bunch of other things. And it's an absolutely fantastic idea, and I am completely in favor of it. The one argument that is made sort of against this, Pat, is that by making it free, you are going to bog down the system in a way that will make it untenable. You are going to have unsavory characters hanging out on public transit indefinitely. I'm not really worried about that second part, because the truth is that there can still be rules against just loitering on public transit if you're not going anywhere. Those rules in most places exist now. They can exist. They can continue existing even if it's free. That hasn't stopped so-called unsavories and vagrants from making it on to public transit systems. So that I'm not really worried about. I would be more worried about the capacity issue. If all public transit is free, are you going to all of a sudden not have enough capacity to meet demand? Luxembourg, I think, doesn't really have to worry about that because their population is relatively small. I think it's going to be fine for them.
I suppose then you just purchase more trains or make the trains longer. Here in Boston, we have the MBTA, and for riding the subway, the cost is something like $2. And I always thought, like, that there's no way that they're profiting that much off of the $2 fares. If anything, that they're just losing money and the rest is subsidized by the state. Why don't we just get rid of that fare? I mean, $2 doesn't add up to a lot, even when you account for all the people on that train. I think it just makes sense to get rid of it.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, yes, and you're completely correct that in Boston, those rides are subsidized by the state. That's why they only cost, I think it's $2.75 for the subway and maybe $2.10 or something like that for the bus. I don't remember exactly. But number one, a lot of money is collected from those $2.10 and $2.75 fares. That's number one. But number two, Boston is different than Luxembourg. I am in favor of free public transit. Believe me, I think that in terms of relating to issues of economic justice, free public transit would be a fantastic thing to allow more people to take jobs that require daily public transit. I think it would be great. I do think that in Boston, you would have a capacity issue if you did that. And you're right, Boston would just need to get more trains and buses, but then you are starting to add congestion to the tracks, at least as far as the subway goes, which already often are very delayed. So I want this to happen. I think it would be great to happen in more places. I recognize, though, that you do need to make adjustments and calculations. You can't just say, hey, it's now free and expect it to work perfectly in a huge city.
I think it would make the life of the commuter a lot better, because if you're taking the train, now you no longer have to pay that fare. And if you're still going to drive into work, well, now there are way fewer cars and less traffic. So it's a win-win for everyone. Ultimately, you would have to see a rise in taxes, most likely. But as long as that's proportioned in the correct way, I think this is going to be a good idea.
There's a really funny thing that sometimes happens where I see people in Boston-related online message boards and forums and subreddits complain about how the big double-length buses here in Boston cause so much traffic. And I sympathize with the sentiment that oftentimes those buses on narrower streets, they can't pull over to pick up passengers because they're articulated in the middle. And so even if the front of the bus pulls over, the back of the bus is still in the middle of the street. So I get that you might feel as though the bus is delaying you. When you consider the number of people that the bus carries and you realize that one route for that bus is probably keeping hundreds of cars off of the streets, the idea that buses cause congestion gets very, very funny. And I felt that annoyance at the bus blocking me. But the truth is that if you replace the bus with 100 cars, the traffic is going to be way worse, I can assure you.
I ride the bus every so often, and when I'm on that thing, I just feel like, hey, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. We should be able to drive recklessly, pull over whenever we want, and just completely obstruct traffic and dominate the rest of the cars on the road. But then again, when I'm just walking, because I also do a lot of that, I make sure that if I have that walk signal, I'm going. I don't care if one of those big buses wants to take a turn. I'm going first. Even if they start beeping at me, I'm going to assert the right of way. So what this boils down to is I'm a total hypocrite when it comes to traffic issues.
Yeah, but if you have a walk sign, why would they honk at you for crossing with a walk sign? I don't get it.
It's very aggressive, but they do that. They will do that, and I have none of it.
Yeah, well, good for you. Speaking of commuting in cars, there are something called squeegee people. I don't know. I think that's the way that we refer to them. They exist in many cities where they sort of hang out at busy intersections. When there's a red light, this happens all over the world, they have a squeegee and they will come over to your windshield. And sometimes they will ask, do you want me to clean the windshield? And then they expect a tip or some amount of money for doing that. Sometimes a more aggressive move is they don't ask. They just come over and they spray the windshield and immediately start squeegeeing it to sort of guilt you into giving them some money, even if you didn't want that service. It happens all over the world. I see it in Argentina when I visit. I see it in Boston. And in Baltimore, commuters are not pleased with it, and they are actually looking to have the city figure out some way to stop this from going on. They are saying it's a form of aggressive panhandling, which is illegal in Baltimore. And this entire aggressive panhandling thing is actually an issue in a lot of places, because what determines panhandling being aggressive is obviously subjective. In the home city of the David Pakman Show, where we started, Northampton, Massachusetts, there is a relatively, for the population, high amount of panhandling that goes on in the downtown, and there have been a number of discussions with the city council about the limits of free speech and where it becomes aggressive panhandling. In Baltimore, the argument that some are making is that the aggressive nature of showing up and just spraying someone's windshield and starting to clean it with the assumption of a tip, that qualifies as aggressive and thus it should be banned. The counter argument, Pat, is that the ordinances around panhandling haven't been effective before, and this is simply not going to make a difference. We should instead look at improving the economic conditions that lead to people doing the squeegee panhandling. I honestly don't know what the answer is. Well,
it certainly shouldn't be a high priority for police officers, but if they see people doing it, I think it is reasonable to crack down on the squeegeers. I'm not bothered by people who, just offer the service, but I have been the victim, if you will, of those aggressive squeegeers who are essentially just extorting you because they start doing it even when you protest and wave your hands and try to wave them off. And then you're somehow indebted to them, even though you didn't ask for the service in the first place. It's a form of coercion, certainly a low-level form of coercion, but I don't like it at all, and it always pisses me off when it happens to me.
Well, it's a similar strategy to, there used to be the Hare Krishnas would hang out at airports, and when security at airports was different, and they would go up to people and often give them something, like give them a flower or whatever. And the idea is, if you receive something from someone, even at the subconscious level, you might be like 5% more likely to then give something in return. So even if you don't have any intention of giving any money, if you've received something, if even 5% of the people who have no intention of giving money say, well, you know what, I'm just going to hand over $1, it's effective, right? Assuming that it's a numbers game, which it is, and you're hitting as many people as possible in that way. Yeah, I never accept the squeegee. I always wave it off, although recently it hasn't been, in my neighborhood, it doesn't really happen that much, but I always wave it off. I'm never interested in having my windshield washed. And quite frankly, my windshield doesn't often need washing. It's just an extraneous service for me.
Yeah, so another example would be the people here in Boston who hang out outside of 7-Eleven and Dunkin' Donuts and hold the door open for you as you walk in and say a little help on the way out. That also sort of bothers me too. Hypothetical situation, you are driving in traffic, you're stopped at a red light, a squeegeer comes over, you try to wave him off, but he has none of it, he starts squeegeeing your windshield. What do? Do you give him the tip, or do you just say, hey, I was not going to do this, I didn't ask for this, and I just got to wash for free?
Yeah, I would just not do anything. I would not roll my window down. I would not say anything. And then I would just say, I don't have any money through the windshield. I don't have any cash, which is basically
Yeah.
always true. I effectively don't carry any cash with me. And I would just say, I'm sorry. I told you no. I don't know what else to say.
And the bad thing is that you drive away from that scenario feeling like you're a bad person. At least that's how I come away from it feeling.
Yeah, to some degree, I would feel bad for sure. So let's talk about something else. California is now mandating solar power on new home construction. First state in the country that is doing this. The upfront cost of solar systems, solar power systems, not solar systems, is still relatively high relative to what California real estate costs. They are not so high, but there is now California building code, which from 2020 onwards will say that every new home needs 2 to 3 kilowatts of electricity generated from or sourced, collected by solar panels. And the building industry is complaining that this is going to hurt them because now they are going to have to tell their customers, you have to build this solar power capability. So your house is going to cost $8,000 to $12,000 more. I tend to agree with this. I think that in the same way that at different points in history, building code has determined what are acceptable heating methods, what are acceptable exhaust methods, what kind of ventilation is required. It's totally reasonable that over time, those building codes would continue to evolve and that at some point renewable energy would be part of it. Like, I really don't see the controversy, Pat, beyond maybe the timing, and I understand the cost aspect of it. But this is why we have building codes, because we need some way to sort of normalize, quantify, and determine what is a balance for the best interests of all parties involved. And when we think about an industry such as building, the environment is a party that's involved in that.
What about the rock solid libertarian argument on building codes, though? That do you really want the government to get involved in having your pipe this far away from a water line and having this so far away from an electrical line? Wouldn't it just make sense to let the builders do what they want to do because they're incentivized to build the best structure possible for you so they can get good ratings on Yelp? And ultimately, competition will start kicking in and you'll have different companies competing and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I've heard that somewhere before. I don't remember exactly where, but all you need to do is look at the real world to understand that we tried that and it hasn't worked. There are massive lawsuits against home builders. Very often you don't even know, I feel like we're recreating the conversation between Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan because it just went in exactly the way that it should have gone. The average homeowner doesn't have the time to learn building code, and saying buyer beware just doesn't work. This is a very complex thing: electrical, plumbing, energy generation, earthquake resist, all these different things. I don't think it's reasonable to simply say we're going to have a libertarian utopia where it's up to the individual to learn about how the electrical system should work and all this other stuff. Building code makes sense. We know exactly what builders do. Oftentimes, the problems don't arise for years to the point where it may not even become known that it was something that builder A or builder B did that led to this disaster in someone's home. And I think that this is totally reasonable. Most homes need 7 to 8 kilowatts, and the requirement is only for 2 to 3. It's just a little step in the right direction, just a fraction of the energy that is used. I think this is great, and I look forward to seeing its implementation in California.
Yeah, the issue of these problems not manifesting themselves, I think, is, for like 10 years or 20 years later, I think is the best argument against it, because I don't think the builder is going to be too concerned if he's no longer in practice, if he's moved on to some other career, or if he's passed away. Like, this just doesn't work like the libertarian utopia would suggest that it does.
Yeah, and you would also have to sort of penetrate, even if the company exists, you would have to penetrate through corporate liability to personal liability in some cases, which would be difficult. That's why we have things like corporations and limited liability companies. So the idea of holding the individual accountable, you might have totally different people in charge of the company, of the building company, by the time that a problem manifests. And really, the gripe is with the individual who cut the corners, and we just need regulations. We need building code. We need uniformity when it comes to how things are being built. I'm not talking about visual uniformity, the type of sort of oppressive homeowners association stuff. I'm just saying in terms of what an acceptable construction method is, building code is extraordinarily valuable. I support building code, Pat.
Well, I'm not against all regulation, of course. I just like this line of thinking. Like, what amount of government can we get rid of, and where should it stop?
Yes, very, very good questions. And I think when it comes to building regulations, I am in favor. If you're against building regulations, please write to me. Please write to me and tell me exactly why. That's it for today. We've got a great week of shows. Monday, I may not be here. I have jury duty, and I have to call in Friday late to see if I actually need to show up on Monday. If so, we will have a guest host. If not, I will be here. But this week I'm here, which is very, very exciting, particularly for me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.